I'd like to start by just pointing out that the CFR was produced by the Council of Europe. And the Council of Europe, whom I represent but have never actually worked for, is concerned with, as it says up there, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. The Council of Europe is an older and larger organization than the European Union. It's not the same. The European Council is the committee of the heads of government of the European Union, whereas the Council of Europe, in German Europarat, is Europe's leading human rights body. And the Court of Human Rights is in Strasbourg, is a Council of Europe institution. And the Council of Europe got involved in language learning in the 1960s. In 1964 was the beginning of what was called the major project. There was playing around with, in the early 70s, very early 70s, there was experimentation with can-do descriptors for self-assessment, with needs analysis, the definition of needs, Richter and Chancerelle, published later, in terms of not just target needs, but also ongoing personal needs of students. And various aspects of things which you associate with the CFR go back to the early 1970s. There was an attempt to produce first attempt to produce a common framework in the mid-70s with a conference at Ludwigshafen. Well, there was first of all a conference in Switzerland in '71 to launch a project that the first step was the development of the threshold level, which was the first definition of needs. And those needs were the needs of an adult immigrant living in another country. So it started off with a concern for migrants. And the author of, the main author, well, the authors of Threshold Level were Jan van Eck and John Trim. And John Trim was the person who led the project on the Common European Framework. The French version of Threshold Level, Niverseuil, Daniel Coste was the main author. He was the second author of the framework, and I was the third. And the work in Strasbourg on the framework was flanked by a national research project in Switzerland with Günther Schneider and myself to produce the descriptors. And Günther Schneider was the main author of the German version of Threshold Level, Kontaktschwelle. So there is a link between all of these things. But the main point to make is that the program of the Council of Europe is concerned with quality inclusive education for all. And the language part is predominantly concerned with plurilingual and intercultural education. And this was the title of the event which launched the companion volume in May this year. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the companion volume and very, very briefly the project that produced it. So I'm going to be talking about the CFR, which, just to remind you, is that thing with the levels, remember? But it has a lot more to it than levels, which we will see. But the levels are defined by descriptors. And sorry, it started to go a bit strange. These are some descriptors. I'll just read the first one. Can take an active part in informal discussion in familiar contexts, commenting, putting a point of view clearly, evaluating alternative proposals, and making and responding to hypotheses. This is one of 3 descriptors there for B2 on the scale in informal discussion with friends. So the framework, if you can't quite read that, that is the family of scales, descriptor scales for interaction. And if we zoom in a little bit, you can see that under spoken interaction, we have overall spoken interaction, then understanding an interlocutor, conversation, informal discussion with friends, formal discussion in meetings, goal-oriented cooperation, right? So even at this stage, you have the idea of goal-oriented collaboration on a project or something. And then I have to go back so I can read the others. I can't actually, but anyway. After that comes obtaining goods and services, and then information exchange, and then another one, which is a new one in the companion volume, using telecommunications. And then alongside that, you've got written interaction, overall written interaction, correspondence, and note-taking. At the time, people were, applied linguists even, were quite, to use a polite word, skeptical about the idea of what they called dividing writing into 2. But the idea of the 4 skills had been criticized already for like at least 15 years or 20 years before we moved from the idea of the 4 skills to the idea of 4 modes of communication. Because the 4 skills is just reception and production. You divide divide reception and production by spoken written, you get the 4 skills. And this is a very artificial division, and it completely ignores the fact that most language use is actually interaction, which is a combination of speaking and listening, which is more than the sum of those 2 parts. It doesn't just consist of, it's not a 1 plus 1 makes 2, it's a 1 plus 1 makes 3 situation. The majority of people have studiously ignored this and continue to work with the 4 skills. But the main point is that the CEFR already in 2001 or already in 1996 suggested moving on from a model which dates from 1961 and has been very good, but it is time to move on. So I'm going to talk a little about the companion volume, and I'll just start with a reminder on what the CEFR is all about. And the title of the CEFR is the Common European Framework for Reference for Languages, Learning, Teaching, Assessment. That order is very deliberate. The CEFR is not an assessment instrument. It is not about examinations. The fact that back in 2001, 2, 3, 4, 5, it was picked on very quickly by the member states and also examination authorities to align their exams to a common European system, which they were very interested in, has led very many people to think that the CEFR is primarily about testing, language testing, and assessment and certificates. This is not really true, because the main function and aim of the CEFR is to stimulate, to encourage reflection about how you do things and how they might be done better. And each section of the CEFR ends with a section which we call reflection boxes. Users of the CEFR may wish to consider, and then you have a whole list of points of things to think about. There are no recipes given out. There are no answers. It's just a stimulation to think, are you taking account of this? Is that important in your setting, etc.? So it's not a question of laying down the law. It's a question of opening up options and possibilities. But the main message of the CEFR is planning, planning, teaching, and assessment. Because curriculum should be seen as a dynamic system. This is Graves, is an American, writing in 2008. And as she says, planning, implementation, and evaluation decisions should be consistent and independent rather than undertaken in a lockstep or piecemeal approach. A curriculum doesn't exist until it has been enacted. A curriculum is not a thing on paper. A curriculum is there is this experiential aspect to a curriculum. It only actually exists when it is enacted in reality. And the point is that the 3 sections, the planning, the enacting, and the evaluation, all need to roll into each other. And this is the role that descriptors play. Descriptors can play, because descriptors can orient these 3 stages. The descriptors can help you in planning the content of your curriculum, which is what we did with the core inventories and equals, where you analyze what's in the descriptors and what it implies in terms of the language, etc., etc. And then in terms of how you're enacting it with the students, you can involve the students in the process by telling them what's happening, using some of the descriptors. And then again, when it comes to evaluating, they know now what the criteria are, and so it's not a surprise in what sort of marks they get. That's the basic idea, that the whole thing should be linked up. So planning, goal setting, and signposting to students with can-do descriptors. Teaching, seeing language as a can-do, as an activity, as something that you do. It is very complicated for language teachers. Language teachers are in the unique position in which language is an object of study. It's the vehicle of communication, and it's the means of access to all knowledge. That's a lot, and it's not the case with any other subject. So this is what complicates the job, because you're having to deal with all of those 3 things at the same time. that it's an object of study. You can't avoid that. At some point or other, you've got to actually concentrate and study on learning things like irregular verbs. And it's the means of communication, and above all, it's the way you access knowledge, the way you access thought even, not just knowledge. And then in tasks, the descriptors can help you to design tasks, the descriptors from Chapter 4, and to design criteria, the descriptors from Chapter 5. Chapter 4 is about all the different things that learners do, and Chapter 5 is about aspects of competence. If we look now at the companion volume, the companion volume contains these various things. There's a text on the wait a minute, something strange is happening here. Yeah, the companion volume. There's a text on key aspects of the CFR for teaching and learning. There is a complete set of the descriptors, both the old ones and the new ones. And there are a number of appendices. And one of the appendices I should point out, I haven't got a slide on it, but there are examples of an extension of the descriptors, examples of what these could mean in the personal, public, occupational, and educational domains. So you have to give you ideas for what kind of tasks might be involved in the descriptors. The text on the CFR is a reminder of what it's all about, basically, with the aims, implementing the action-oriented approach, what is plurilingual and pluricultural competence, about the descriptive scheme, mediation, etc., etc. And notice that very deliberately the levels do not appear at the top. You know, it's not primarily about the levels even. And then the fact that one should use the descriptors ideally for profiling. People are better at some things than other things. Everybody is people who are B1 are all B1 for a different reason. Nobody's B1 for the same reasons. They have things they're better at and worse at. We're going to focus on mediation and a little on plurilingual pluricultural competence. So the main point is that the CFR Companion Volume completes the descriptive scheme. The descriptive scheme, as I said, moves away from the 4 skills and says that communication is an integral part of tasks where participants engage in interaction, production, reception, and mediation, or a combination of 2 or more of these. So that's a picture of the scheme. So you have, or at least communicative language proficiency consists of, on the left-hand side, general competences, which is the yellow bit, which you can't read. Sorry about that. But in any case, they're best expressed in French with les savoirs, savoir-faire, and savoir-être. Savoir-être is a lot more than just attitude. In English, that gets translated usually as knowledge, skills, and attitudes. But attitudes, it's not really about attitudes. I mean, attitudinal research is all just about self-report. You know, people say, they feel, etc. It's very untrustworthy. Anything that is just self-report is very untrustworthy. And it's very easy, you know, I mean, attitudes are important, but it's what you do with attitudes that is important, that is far more important. Savoir-être has the whole idea of, as the word suggests, knowing how to be in a certain situation, in all situations. So it has the main thing you're talking about there is interculturality in savoir-être. It's not about attitudes, it's interculturality. It's the ability to move between different worldviews, to shift perspectives when necessary, as in the way that Uwe put it yesterday, to navigate in between spaces, between different cultures when necessary. And cultures are not just national cultures. This happens at work. You know, it happens in an office. There are different cultures in an office, and that you have to navigate between. So you notice, and then there's communicative language proficiency. The second column is communicative language competences, is more traditional, linguistic, pragmatic, sociolinguistic. Then we come to the communicative language activities, and on the right, strategies. And there you have reception, interaction, reception, production, interaction, and mediation. And it's interaction and mediation that are new in the CFR. So before the CFR, you thought in terms of the learner, of a learner, and the focus was on the 4 skills, reception and production. The role of the learner was seen as a speaker, hearer, and the focus was on learning language as a code. In more enlightened circles, you talked about accuracy and fluency, that it's not good, you can't just mark people, take off marks for making mistakes, you've got to consider fluency as well. But you're basically still talking about the use of language as a code. And in order to do that, you mobilize your linguistic resources, what you've learned. With the 2001 CEFR, things move on with the introduction of interaction and mediation. And with interaction, the learner is seen as a participant who takes part in interaction. And the main focus is on the negotiation of meaning in that interaction. It's not just a question of whoop, and the other person goes whoop. It's not whoop, whoop. That is not how a conversation works. And then with mediation, things are suggested a bit further. Mediation is mentioned in the CEFR. I mean, I did a presentation of this possibility at the symposium, intergovernmental symposium, which recommended the development of the CEFR, and at that point I had reception, interaction, production, and processing. And it was Daniel Kost who decided to change processing into mediation, because it had a much broader meaning. But there was then a little bit of, we didn't really have time to get to the grips fully with what we were talking about there, and that's why there were no descriptors, because the Swiss project was running at the same time as writing the CEFR, and we couldn't suddenly start another project on mediation just because halfway through we had thought up this idea of mediation. And even in the world in general, it wasn't that clear what mediation meant at that point. I mean, we'll come to that in a moment, but it has, in the 20 years since the CEFR was written, mediation has become mainstream in education, the concept of mediation. It's all to do with sociocultural, socio-constructivist views of Vygotskian views of seeing all learning as a question of outside in. You learn stuff in a social environment and then you internalize it as an individual. And that process, by which that happens, is mediation. So, the model with the companion volume is the learner as a social agent who exercises agency in situations. And the focus now has jumped, in addition to complexity, as well as just accuracy and fluency. There's far more of a focus on complexity of language that's being used. And not just on the negotiation of meaning, but also on the co-construction of meaning. You could say that, yes, of course, interaction's about co-construction, but it's about co-construction of a text, is the way that the idea is usually used. Whereas in mediation, when we talk about co-construction, we mean co-construction of meaning in the sense of co-construction of concepts. So co-construction of new knowledge. So this starts to be very, very relevant to things like CLIL. It starts to break down the rigid barrier between foreign languages and what happens with languages in other parts of the school curriculum, because this is now it's relevant across the language curriculum. And the idea is to mobilize not just your linguistic competencies, but your general and plurilinguistic and pluricultural competencies. So, our job was to operationalize this vision with new descriptors. And there was a team of 8 of us, an inner team of 4, and an outer team of 4 who were a sounding board, who contributed by email and at meetings. So we had 4 people who authored the descriptors and worked on them. And we produced descriptors for online interaction, which is the digital kind of aspect of interaction, mainly written but also spoken online. For mediation, and we in the end included literature, reactions to literature, creative text under mediation, because when you read literature, I'll explain that later, and plurilingual, pluricultural, and also sign language. So the new CEFR, the new CEFR, there we are, I said it. It's actually an update, right? The update to the CEFR includes sign language. And the project was a 4-year project, basically. The development took just over a year, January 14 to 15 then. The validation was another year, which I'll just mention very briefly, the way we went on. And then the analysis, of course, and then there was a consultation phase, which went on for a long time. I mean, there was, first of all, there was a meeting, then there was a conference, then there was a big survey, which was open from October till Christmas. And the survey, there were of member states, of institutions, and of any individual experts who wanted to do it. 27 member states replied out of the 47. Okay, it's not all of them, but you know, it's a large number. Some 30 institutions and 500 people, individuals. And I'm not going to say any more about that, except that the scales were 80%. We had a thing where you said, do you find this useful? You know, yes, very much, yes, not really, and no. And all of the scales got 80% yes and yes very much, except for 2 which were on mediation, 2 of the scales for mediation strategies, which are a little bit, how can I put it, more difficult to grasp what they are about. They got sort of 79, 78. So, and the most popular thing to come out from the member states was the descriptors on plurilingual and pluricultural competence. Then we had piloting. We had 6 months of piloting. There were 70 pilots, including, I think, about 6 or 8 within CEBS. And then the finalization took place August to October. At the moment, you've got the French version has been online since January or February. The German version is almost finished, but we're published with Langenscheidt. So just a quick word on the validation. That took part in 3 phases throughout the year. First, there was a phase of qualitative validation, where people were asked to validate the categories and the descriptors themselves. So assign a list of descriptors, assign them all to a category, and then say, do you like it? You know, evaluate it. Is it good? So, like, is it clear? Is it clear? Yes, no. Is it pedagogically useful? Yes, no. Is it relevant to language use of these students in the real world? Yes, no. In order to get rid of descriptors that were not so good, and suggesting reformulations. And of course, teachers, being teachers, are very good at reformulating things. So we got a lot of really good information, and it's at that point that they started to become good descriptors. Then the second round, there were 2 rounds of quantitative validation then. One was asking people to assign things to levels, and then finally an online survey. Now, what I like to say is that the first 2 rounds, the first 2 rounds, 1 and 2, were workshops. They were face-to-face workshops in institutions around the place. So there were 140 institutes involved in round 1. That means that there were 140 face-to-face workshops took place in which there were at least 990 people involved, because there were like 445 pairs. And then in the second round, by then we were up to 189 institutes, and there were almost 1,300 people involved. And that, again, was a face-to-face workshop where people discussed the descriptors together, and then afterwards wrote down what they thought on paper, and then turned around to their computer and put it in. So it was a considered judgment during a training event, basically. It wasn't just someone sitting at home, you know, while they're cooking, you know, sort of just quickly doing things. And then finally, there was a quantitative validation. The reason for that was to be able to calibrate back to the original scale, back to the scale behind the original descriptors. And that was done by saying, think of a person, could be yourself in different languages, or could be your son, your husband, your whatever. Could you, or the person concerned, do what's described in the descriptor? 0, beyond his or her capacities. 1, yes, under favorable circumstances. 2, yes, under normal circumstances. 3, yes, even in difficult circumstances. And 4, this is insulting. You know, this is clearly better than this. This is the scale used to calibrate the original descriptors back 20 years ago. So in order to put it all onto the same scale, this was done. So we get to the new scales. And in the CFR, mediation is introduced like this. In mediating activities, the language user is not concerned to express his or her own meanings, but simply to act as an intermediary between interlocutors who are unable to understand each other directly, normally, but not exclusively, speakers of different languages. So there can be lots of reasons why two people don't understand each other, not just language. It can be cultural, can be just one person knows stuff the other person doesn't know, and they don't realize that's the problem, etc. And then the second one is mediation language activities reprocessing an existing text occupy an important place in our normal linguistic functioning of our societies. So those are two key kind of activities, acting as an intermediary and mediating text. But there is more to it than that. And in fact, the word mediation, it comes into lots of different things. There's this idea of linguistic and textual mediation, which we just mentioned, both interlinguistic and intralinguistic, but there's also cultural mediation, facilitating understanding across barriers, cultural awareness, both within and across languages, because you have subcultures and you have registers, different registers and niveau de langue in languages. Then there's the whole thing of social mediation, preventing or dealing with conflict, disputes. Also playing the role of intermediary is also there's a social aspect to that. And the idea of critical cultural awareness, being able to mediate between your own culture and another culture, etc. Plus pedagogic mediation. I mean, the core meaning of mediation in education, in initial teacher training, is this idea of helping people to understand things. Mediating knowledge and concepts and things like, the zone of proximity, etc. come up. And there are different aspects to that, both cognitive and relational, which we'll come on to. So you've got all of these different things: linguistic, pedagogic, social, cultural, textual, and also people in media studies use the word mediation all the time. We ended up with this model where you have a kind of an emotional the emotional sort of thing is around everything, and then you have mediations in the middle, and right in the center you have cognitive mediation. It's about constructing meaning or passing on meaning, so there's something cognitive. But around that there is a band of relational mediation. In order to be able to do the cognitive stuff, you have to first organize things. You have to get people talking to each other. As a teacher, you would like to spend all your time on cognitive mediation, but half the time you're getting people to sit down, find their pen, stop talking, etc. That is all relational mediation. Or reorganizing the room. Let's form groups. You three, please go over there. This is all relational. And then it gets complicated. Where does it stop? I mean, we mentioned online, so you have mediation across media. We've mentioned different languages, so we're talking about mediating across languages and cultures, which clearly relates to the concept of plurilingual and pluricultural competence, which is introduced in the CFR. And then you have the idea of across worlds, the inner world, the outer world, so-called reality, etc. Literature, where authors mediate to you their experience, and it's the thing about literature is that it has that strong effect. But if you read a good book, you generally want to talk about it, and you have these groups who meet to talk about books and say how they react to them. So we ended up with three main headings: mediating communication, mediating concepts, and mediating text. Mediating communication, creating space, managing tension, counseling, conflict resolution, all that kind of thing. Then co-constructing or constructing meaning and knowledge from social to individual and vice versa, from individual to social, mediating concepts. And then reformulating, transcoding, alternating languages, switching oral to written, changing genre, combining text and other modes of communication, etc. That's all mediating text. The text can be video, can be pictures, can be anything. The word text is used very broadly there. And basically, facilitating communication is facilitating conditions and handling trouble. Mediating concepts is mainly to do with collaboration in small groups, and this goes back to collaborative strategies and cognitive strategies, which were already around in the 80s, talking about how do you collaborate in a group, what are the roles, what you do need to train people, kids, how to do group work. They don't do it well automatically if they're not shown what they're supposed to be doing. And then mediating a text recalls integrated skills, the idea of summarizing, the good old précis, and relaying information, etc. So, mediating concepts and mediating text, there's an echo there of what in the 1980s was called two-tier group work. I used to do this a lot, where you have 4 groups in the room, you give them each a different text on a subject, or a different piece of the same text. Remember jigsaw reading? And then you put them together in new groups, and they have to negotiate, work out the story, etc. Or decide who would get the job, which of the, they were 4 candidates, and now which of them is going to get. This is not entirely new. This has been around for a while. What is new is that bit on mediating communication. And of course, the idea of putting this all together is new. And it can be done in one language, and the first thing that springs to mind is CLIL. Or it can be done across languages, where one phase is done in a target language and the other is done in the mother tongue. Or you can be mixing the two all the time. It doesn't matter. It does matter, sorry, but I mean it's a way of you can do these kinds of tasks at a very low level if it's accepted that at a certain point they're allowed to use their mother tongue, and at a certain point they must use the target language. So it can be done in flexible ways. Anyway, these are the scales we ended up with. So under mediating a text, we have relaying specific information, which is picking out what time does the bus leave, what did they say about the weather tomorrow. In this article, he mentions an article I wrote 5 years ago. Ah, yes, there it is. Right? It's finding something specific. So there's a scale, reading for orientation, in the framework. And it's the equivalent of that. Once you've got the information, what do you do with it? It's passing it on to somebody else. Then explaining data, like you have in university exams like IELTS, you have to explain data. Processing a text is summarizing, explaining the content of a text. Translating a written text, which could be oral or written. All of these can be oral or written. Very often people come up to you and say, what does that mean? And show you a letter and say, you speak German, don't you? What's that say? They don't want you to spend hours with a dictionary, giving them a perfect translation. They just want to know what it says. They don't think it's something very difficult. They want you to just read it and then tell them what it says. And listening and note-taking in a lecture where you're mediating for yourself, and then the 2 on literature, one more personal, expressing a personal response to literature, the other more academic, more sort of university, gymnasium level, analysis and criticism. Linked to all of that, mediating strategies, so linking back to previous knowledge to help people to understand, breaking down complicated information, and then usually chaining it up again, adapting language, so if it's technical language, simplifying it for somebody, if it's just complex language, simplifying it for somebody, elaborating a dense text. If a text is difficult to understand because it's just so dense and uses difficult words, then just expanding it, throwing in some examples, paraphrasing, repeating. And the opposite, streamlining a text. If a text is difficult to understand because it goes in all different directions and it's difficult to follow the Leitfaden, it's a nice expression you cannot translate into English, then you streamline it by saying that's irrelevant, let's get it back to a nice shape. Mediating concepts, which is also could be regarded as being interaction strategies, is facilitating collaborative interaction with peers, collaborating to construct meaning, managing interaction and encouraging conceptual thought. 2 of those are conceptual, collaborating to construct meaning and encouraging conceptual thought. They are both on constructing meaning. The other two are relational, facilitating the collaborative interaction, inviting other people in to speak, organizing the task at the beginning, saying who's going to do what. Or managing interaction, that's what you do as a teacher all the time. You manage interaction in a classroom. But it's not just in education that people do those things. I mean, encouraging conceptual thought is pushing people to express their argument. Sort of probing, asking people to justify their opinion or building on what someone else said and creating a chain of thought and getting it into a proposition. These are all things that happen in good group work. It's the sort of thing that happens in management seminars. You know, you go up a mountain to discuss next year's, the strategy for the next 5 years. This is what goes on. So this is not just in education, this is very important in the world of work. And finally, mediating communication, facilitating pluricultural space, acting as an intermediary, and facilitating communication in delicate situations and things. Plus, there are separate scales for plurilingual and pluricultural competences, for online interaction, and for literature. Examples of descriptors. At B1, mediating concepts in collaborative group work can use questions, comments, and simple reformulations to maintain the focus of a discussion, right? Not that impossible. Or can ask questions to invite people to clarify their meaning. Mediating a text, pretty straightforward, can relay in German the specific information given in straightforward informational text such as leaflets, brochure entries, notices, and letters and emails written in English. Mediating communication, facilitating communication in delicate situations, B1, can demonstrate his or her understanding of the key issues in a disagreement on a topic familiar to him and make simple requests for confirmation or clarification. So is this what your problem is? So at B1, people can do all of these things. At A2, they can do very many of them. Finally, we haven't got time to really look at tasks. Oh, we have 10 minutes. Oh, wow. So then I'm looking at my watch. So, okay, so we do have time to look at some example tasks. For example, here you have a menu which happens to be in 2 languages. It's in English and French, but you can't read it, but it doesn't matter. You see it's got various things in the middle, and on the left, they're in English, and the right, they're in French. This will be more useful when you see a copy of it on the website. So what you could imagine here is that phase 1, you've got 2 students. This is a pair activity. The first phase is mediating a text. The second phase is dead simple. It's acting as an intermediary with the server. So one person doesn't understand English or French. They're the German speaker. So student A is explain the different dishes and options to your friend who does not speak English or French. Prepare yourself in advance with the help of a dictionary, the glossary in your textbook, and then role play. Student B, after understanding the menu, choose what you want to drink and tell your friend who'll place the order for both. And then along comes the server, another student role-playing the server, and student A and B have questions about the different dishes that the server needs to answer. So student A will have to translate all the questions and put the questions, and then student B the server will also have questions like, how do you want your steak? What side dishes do you want? Etc. I mean, it's quite easy to imagine. You probably even do this at A1. If you find them, the trouble is menus are quite complicated. So, but you can find simple menus that would be okay for A1 on the web. So that's an A1 idea. What does this involve? Well, these are the descriptors. It's at A2. In plurilingual comprehension, can understand short, clearly written messages and instructions by piecing together what he understands from the versions in different languages, from the French and the English, or can use parallel translations of texts, like magazine articles, stories, passages from novels, to develop comprehension in different languages. Well, here it's a menu, but you could do the same thing with other things. And then acting as an intermediary, can communicate in language B, so can communicate in French or English the main point of what is said in German in predictable everyday situations, conveying back and forth information about personal wants and needs, etc., provided people help. A B1 example, 2 videos on climate change, for example. I did this rather quickly, and the problem with this activity, I realize now, is that one video is 5 minutes long and the other video is 15 minutes long. This is impossible in a classroom situation. But you get the idea. You have two videos. You know, they watch, you've got two groups. They watch the different videos. So the first step is mediating for themselves, watching the video and making a few notes. The second step is mediating processing a text. Student A explaining everything about theirs to student B. And then you can remix so it says, explain to your partner the facts and viewpoints expressed in your video. Listen to your partner's explication of theirs. Interrupt to ask for clarification, check comprehension, ask for more details, etc. And then join another pair, so two pairs join together. So you've got two people who saw the first video and two people who saw the second video. Join another pair to make a group of four. Discuss the two videos together. And then when you finish doing that, formulate A, what you think must be done, and B, how people like you could help to persuade your government to adopt this policy, for example. But it could be about anything. But the point here is that you have three phases. Phase one is you do something for yourself, the comprehension, and take notes. Phase two, you exchange with a different person. And then phase three, you have a discussion. You have a collaborative discussion in order to produce some sort of artifact or product. It could be to write a letter to somebody. It could be that the final thing for homework is that you write a letter, or that you could prepare a poster, or that you, even something quite simple like prepare a slogan. Prepare a slogan to attract people, to draw people's attention to the dangers of climate change. Do not use more than 10 words. You know, I mean, it could be, but there needs to be a concrete product. Otherwise, you get aimless discussion. The point of the action-oriented approach is that the discussion needs to be motivated, and they're trying to do something which is quite challenging. And therefore, they need to mobilize all of their resources. In this particular task, you could have two videos in different languages. You could allow them to do phase two into mother tongue, and then back into the target language for phase three with the discussion, or vice versa. Phase two could be, it all has to be target language, but you allow them in the final phase to speak their mother tongue, and while they're deciding what to do, and then the product has to be produced in the target language. This depends on the level of the students, the type of material, and things like that. And what was involved here was, all at B1 was listening and note-taking. Note-taking was one, can take notes as a list of key points during a straightforward lecture, provided the topic is familiar, etc., etc. Processing text in speech, can summarize in language B, the main points made in long texts delivered orally in language A on topics in his fields of interest, blah, blah. Or can summarize in language B the main points or events in TV programs and video clips in language A, provided he or she can view them several times, right? So, I mean, the 15-minute one, I mean, they'd have to do it at home. And facilitating collaboration, can define the task in basic terms in a discussion and ask others to contribute their expertise and experience. Or collaborating to construct meaning, can use questions, comments, and simple reformulations to maintain the focus of a discussion. Now, the point is that if you, particularly with the last two, if you have a little list of descriptors that are relevant for this task, then you can share that with the students. And they can self-assess how they think they did in the task. And you as a teacher can assess how you think they did in the task. And in fact, in the piloting, this is what everybody did. I didn't tell them, but what everybody did was to give, I didn't say you must give the descriptors to the students, but in fact, everybody did. They chose like between 2 and 5 descriptors for an activity, and then they shared them with the students for self-assessment. Then finally, there are also things in examinations. There's a Greek exam where there's our text about blue flag beaches in Greek, and they have to write a circular to travel agents talking about how wonderful Greek beaches are, basically. There is your own Austrian Berufsmatura Certificate of Plurilingualism produced by our friends over here who organized this conference, plus the rest of the CEBS team. I won't go into detail because I'm sure you're all intimately familiar with it. And at the beginning, they have to pass on the information on a survey. They have an English speaker and a French speaker who cannot speak German, and they have to pass on this information in the survey. And then afterwards, they have to organize a task together. And so the idea is that they are mediating between the English teacher and the French teacher who pretend not to speak each other's languages. So, and just a final word on the piloting. What came out of the piloting was that everybody agreed, and also in the consultation phase, that all of the descriptors are very suitable for goal setting and for self-assessment. In addition, the descriptors for online interaction, mediating a creative text, including literature, and mediating concepts also are suitable for teacher assessment. And that the descriptors for mediating text and acting as an intermediary also suitable for examinations. This is on the evidence so far. Maybe you can do other things, but what's very interesting is that nobody used the descriptors for plurilingual and pluricultural for assessment. They were only used for goal setting and awareness raising, whereas the ones for mediating text and concepts, which are the ones I used mainly in the tasks I showed you, they were used both for self-assessment, goal setting, self-assessment, and teacher assessment. And then finally, it's easier to think of activities for an exam that involve mediating a text or acting as an intermediary, as in the Austrian baccalaureate that I'm sure you all know backwards. So thank you very much. That's it. Here's the link.